All right, good morning, everyone. If it doesn't work today, I don't know what happened because I tested it like 6 times. So hopefully everything will work. And anyone who was here in person, who was not able to hear the sound, hopefully you were able to see it on the website. That did record properly. But today, welcome to the last of the sessions on Narnia for Grown-ups. The last session, it's on the book The Last Battle. So hopefully, if you've been reading along, you made it, or you're about to make it through the 7th book. If last week's was a sort of creation account, a story of the creation retold in The Magician's Nephew, this one is the story of the last book of the Bible, the Revelation. So it's a wonderful, captivating story, and our speaker today, as always, is Terry Lindvall. Terry will be here this coming Thursday for our first speaker series event. So if you can make it, it should be a very lovely evening. As always, we have choral evensong in the church across the street, and then at 5:30, and then dinner at 6 o'clock. And at about 6:30, we'll invite him up, and he'll give a talk. He can answer any questions you have about this material or about his talk on Thursday, which will be on a kind of related topic. But he's a very engaging speaker, so you don't want to miss it if you're available. All right, let's see how we do here.
Welcome to the last lecture of Narnia for Grown-ups. And we're finally grown-ups, so we can graduate after this time. But today we're going to deal with Lewis's last book, which is called The Last Battle. And you'll notice that adjective will reappear quite a few times. Now, Lewis Marcos down at the University of Houston basically said Narnia was C.S. Lewis's literary petri dish. In other words, what he tried to do throughout all of these chronicles is put his theology into the vernacular. How do you communicate what you really believe in the language that you can talk to a grocer or a carman or a student or anyone? And he said, that's what I'm trying to do. And so this was his way of kind of experimenting with that. What we're going to do today is look at the theme of The Last Battle. And essentially, from the medieval era, Lewis, again, was a medieval scholar. He said there were 4 last things. Do you know what they are? You can probably guess the first last thing that's going to happen to you. Well, death, okay? We'll start with the worst, okay? And the 4 last things are basically, and here's Hieronymus Bosch, one of the greatest artists of the 16th century, and he deals with these 4, death, judgment, hell, and heaven. And all 4 of these themes are going to influence. And then, of course, in his great painting, he puts all of the 7 deadly sins around here. And I have a course in which I teach the 7 deadly sins. And it's one of the most enjoyable courses because we get to practice them. No, I'm kidding. The students, gluttony is easy for most of us. So, in fact, there is, I try to show them that there is a day of the week for each of the sins. On Sunday, it's pride. You go to church and you are better than everyone else. Okay? Then, on Monday, it's envy. Because you realize maybe other people had a better car or better outfit or something. And then that leads to Tuesday, anger. And anger comes right after envy. And then third, you start not caring. So Wednesday, it becomes sloth. You just throw yourself off. But then you want something more. And so Thursday becomes greed. And after greed, it'll lead to gluttony. And if you eat too much, it'll lead to lust. And so we have a fun time going through the 7 deadly sins. But Hieronymus Bosch did it before Lewis. So we're going to deal with these 4 as they appear in the last battle. And death is the last enemy. The best way to prepare for death is to spend every day of our lives as if it were the last. This came from St. Philip Neri of Rome, of Florence. He's basically the Jimmy Kimmel of saints. He was so funny. He would do pranks to people that came in for penance. He would make the young monks shave half of their beards or kind of throw feathers all over the place, but he was a really wonderful saint. Now, what Lewis does in dealing with death, he goes to his own experience. And you remember when he was about 10 years old, his mother died. And he said, with my mother's death, everything settled that was happy was now gone. Everything that was tranquil and reliable disappeared from my life. There was to be much fun and many pleasures and more stabs of joy, but no more of the old security. It was all sea and islands now. The great continent had sunk like Atlantis. And so as we age, we realize there's so many things we can't control. And we realize we are not meant to be happy in this life. This life is an inn on our journey. And we have good times at the end, but it's not where we're going to end up. And then death continued when he went in World War I with his friend Patty Moore, who died. And Lewis's sergeant was shot by a shell in the same trench that he was in. And so death came very close to him there. And then finally there was the death of his wife, Helen Joy Davidman. And he wrote this book called A Grief Observed, which was a raw look at how death affected him when he lost this person he loved more than anyone else. And his anger at God, his frustration at God, his concern went out very kind of naked before God. But he comes back to understand how God uses death to draw us close to him. And he is always saying, come home, come home. You who are weary, come home. He talks about two ways of knowing things. And he wrote a book called The Problem of Pain that we know. And it's looking at the pain in a way that's called savoir. Savoir is to know about something, is to understand it. As you have savoir-faire, you know how to behave at parties. So savoir is knowing about something, and he wrote all about pain and death in this book early in his life. But when he lost his wife, he wrote A Grief Observed. And this was a knowledge of connect. Connect means to know by experience, to taste. And both kinds of knowledge are important in our life. We need to know about God, but we also need to know how to taste God. And so this is what Lewis is bringing together in Narnia to give us both kinds of knowledge. And then there was the death of his friend. And he wrote, you have heard of the death of my dearest friend Charles Williams, right at the end of World War II. And no doubt prayed for him. He was writing to one of his friends, a nun called Sister Penelope. For me too, it has been and is a great loss, but not at all a dejecting one. It has greatly increased my faith. Death has done nothing to my idea of Charles, but Charles' death has done, I can't say what, something to my idea of death. It made the next world much more real and palpable. We all feel the same, how one lives and learns. And to another friend, he wrote, basically what I have suffered through all of this, it has really corroborated my understanding of immortality that I never dreamed of. It's almost tangible now. It swept away all my old feelings of horror and disgust at funerals, coffins, graves. If need had been, I think I would have handled a corpse with hardly any unpleasant sensations now. And it greatly reduced my feelings about ghosts. He used to be afraid of ghosts, but he says now, if I saw one, I'd rather be pleased than afraid of it. To put it in a nutshell, he said, what the idea of death has done to him is nothing to what his death has done to the idea of death. Just last year, one of my best friends, George Seelig, died. And George and I had been friends for probably 50 years. And when he died, suddenly I felt first grief, but then this joy, realizing this character is in heaven with God. And there is a lot of wine going around. And George is not serving it, he's drinking it. And you realize your friends, when they die, heaven becomes more real. And it's a place that you want to be reunited with them. And then Lewis himself died on November 22nd, 1963, the same day as Aldous Huxley and John F. Kennedy. All three of them died that day. And yet, of course, Kennedy's assassination was the one that overshadowed the other two. But he wrote a letter just before he died to his friend Philip. To begin with, may I congratulate you on writing such a remarkably good letter. He was a young boy. I certainly could have not written it at your age. And to go on with, thank you for telling me that you like my books, a thing an author is always pleased to hear. It is a funny thing that all the children who have written to me see at once who Aslan is, and grown-ups never do. Please tell your father and mother how glad I am to hear that they find my serious books of some value. With all best wishes to you and to them, sincerely, C.S. Lewis. And so the day he's died, he is still writing letters to children. When he puts the death of Aslan in The Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, he wants us to know that God has demonstrated his love for us, that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. Now, the planet. We've seen all the planets that come. Last week, The Magician's Nephew, we saw the influence of Venus. But now we deal with the worst planet of all, Saturn, or the god of time and Kronos, the god who consumes all things. And basically his name is derived from satas, meaning to sow with a sickle, to gather everything together. It is time for the harvest. Here is Saturn devouring his sun, from Goya's great kind of painting. And so it's a very dark time to deal with it. Dante connects Saturn with astronomy. In the Bible, Amos rebukes the Israelites for worshiping Saturn, like Moloch, the god who devours children, instead of the God who made the stars and the planets, like Pleiades and Orion. In his poem, The Planets, Lewis describes Saturn as the last planet, old and ugly. With Saturn in the 7th region, the 7th book of the series, the sun, its light will grow scant and sickly. The moon that we saw as fun and lunatic will go away. The language of Mercury, the loves of Venus, everything is going to leave us. Even Mars, the strong militant, will fail us. And the mirth of Job is as tin tinkling. And so here is the planet. And you get to read the red. His eyes, father's pale pestilence, the pain of envy, remorse and envy, melancholy drink for bane or blessing of bitter wit. So he's preparing us in the last battle for the appearance of Saturn that's there. On the earth, his influence produces lead. And lead, as you know, creates a heaviness. It's just a dropping down. You can't do anything at all. Saturn is gloomy. He's melancholy. All of these moods. There's disastrous events like the election tomorrow, no matter which way it goes. Okay. The planet is connected with sickness and old age, as well as the traditional image of Father Time with his scythe and hourglass. When you read Chaucer, The Knight's Tale, Saturn promotes fatal accidents, pestilence, treacheries, ill luck, general, even a plague of hemorrhoids. That's because of Saturn, if you've ever had it. In medieval cosmology, Saturn's influence, or influenza, could devastate a community, ushering in sickness and death. COVID was Saturn's gift to us 3 years ago. And so we don't want any more Saturn. Get the rings of Saturn out of here. Paul Ward looked at certain things of Saturnine in this book, and he says certain things happen. First of all, Lewis's voice as someone who is kind of an aside, speaking to us, talking to us, and making jokes, doesn't appear until the end of the book. There's a lot of irony in the book, where we're called to really understand the discrepancy between what's real and what's an appearance. There's no quest. The characters are just trying to survive. The main character is more adult than a child. And the terms like old, last, ugly, and cold, and shivering appear many times. There is death and suffering in here. And the dominant verbs are to kill, to murder, and to die. So once you've read the first 6 books of Narnia and you get to this one, it's a shock. As some would say, you don't even want to give them to grandchildren anymore. But Lewis has a reason for allowing life to go this way. From the silver chair, you may remember, Jill and Eustace go down to the cave, and long ago, down they see there Father Time, and he is going to awake on the last day when the world will end. Even more, Jesus' words in Matthew, Paul's second letter to the church of Thessalonica, the prophet Joel warns of the end times, where the man of lawlessness, the false prophets, and the deception of an antichrist will come. Someone is coming to pretend that they're Aslan, And that's how the book begins. So too, the gospel tells us the sun will be darkened, the moon will turn to blood, and the stars will fall from the sky before the great and terrible day of the Lord. So what Lewis is giving us is this really difficult theology of the end times. He wants children to know before they get scared with other events going on that it's going to happen, but God is still in control. As we see, the great Father Time will squeeze the red sun like an orange. And this basically comes from the Norse idea of the twilight of the gods. But, and this is where Lewis gets back to his Hebrew ideas, there's also a ram's horn. The shofar is going to be blown at the heights of Zion, which is going to be the beginning of a new year and a new life. So, we start the book, and notice the words last. In the last day of Narnia, about 3 weeks later, the last of the kings of Narnia sat under the great oak. During the reign of Tyrion, the last king of Narnia. And then the last battle of the last king began. And when the children, Eustace and Polly, arrive, they feel, this is really Narnia, at last. But that's a pun. They don't realize, at last they're here, but it's the last of Narnia. Astrologists from the Middle Ages see that the planets don't determine human destiny, but they influence it. So we have a centaur in the story who could read the stars just as the Magi in the Gospel of Matthew did. And when Saturn overthrows the joy of Jupiter, basically the centaur, Runwit, is going to be killed, and he prophesies, the stars say nothing of the coming of Aslan, nor of peace, nor of joy. I know by my art that there have not been such disastrous conjunctions of the planets for 500 years when such an evil hangs over Narnia. The stars never lie, but men and beasts do. So what's happening at the beginning of this book is that the ape has discovered a lion skin, and he makes poor Puzzle, a donkey, wear this lion skin, and he says, look, Aslan is back. And so he has created an antichrist that is going to get everyone to follow him and do immoral things, to cut down trees and to destroy nature. All of these things are happening because this ape, this antichrist, has arisen. Look at the kinds of death that occur throughout this book. Tyrion, who is the hero, the last king, and his unicorn friend rashly kill some innocent Calamarines, even though they're the enemy. A dryad, a wood spirit, comes out and dies right in front of the king. Farsight the eagle reports of the centaur's death. The dwarfs will shoot talking horses. And everyone must go through a stable, a door of death. Tash, who is the foreign god, kind of another antichrist figure, collects his own and will take them. But Aslan is awaiting for his faithful. And even in our own world, the children experience a railway accident. So that was death. Death is Saturn coming. Secondly comes judgment. Now, one thing that we can have encouragement on is that the judgment comes after death. And there's a sense in which we go for, as our rector will say, we go before the great judge, and there standing next to him is Jesus. And the great judge will pull out his book and look at the record, and he says, how do you want to plead? And all we have to do is say, there's my advocate. There's my lawyer, who is Jesus. He's going to represent me completely. And your slate is wiped clean. And so we are going to reap what we sow in one sense, yes, but Jesus has taken it upon himself. And the judgment follows death. As appointed unto man once to die, but after this the judgment. And here, many of you have probably been here to the Sistine Chapel over in Florence. It's just kind of magnificent what Michelangelo did to create all these characters, and particularly the ones going down to hell. And these are mostly politicians, so don't worry too much. Okay. Lewis wrote that the Christian apocalyptic offers us no easy hope. It doesn't even foretell a gradual decay. When it happens, he said, it's going to be sudden. It's going to be violent, and it's going to be imposed from without, like an extinguisher popped onto a candle, a brick flung at a gramophone, or a curtain rung down on the play. Everything stops. When the Lord intervenes with his return, it all stops suddenly and not gradually. The doctrine of the second coming has failed, Lewis wrote, so far as we are concerned, if it does not make us realize that every moment of every year in our lives, the poet Donne's question, what if this present moment were our last night? It's always relevant, and our lives should be lived with all of the joy and the hope of that last moment. God in the Dock, Lewis wrote, if you want a religion to make you feel really comfortable, I don't recommend Christianity. He says, if you want something to make you feel comfortable all the time, just serve yourself. Drink a lot, eat a lot, satisfy yourself. You'll feel happy, but it will not be filling, and it will not be true. So he warns us that it is a calling to be a Christian. Now, Shifty Ape is the one who takes this little poor donkey and he makes him wear kind of a lion skin in order to order all the other Narnians around in Aslan's names. And he says, go out and get me oranges, get me bananas, get me nuts. As the fake news of Aslan's return spreads, he orders the sacred trees of the forest to be cut down and shipped to the Calamrine merchants. Jill realizes by mixing a little truth with it, they have made their lies far stronger. And so we have the appearance of an antichrist and a false Messiah. But understand this, Paul writes, that in the last days there will come times of difficulties, because people will love themselves, love money, be proud, arrogant, abuse others. They'll be swollen with conceit and love pleasure rather than love God. And how many of us are called to love God instead of the other things? Now, what happens at the end? In a critical scene, you're going to find what side are you on. And there are a group of dwarves that cannot decide whether they're for Aslan or not for Aslan. In fact, this is their line. Everybody read this. Read again. Okay. So the dwarfs aren't going to say, no, I'm for Aslan, or no, I'm for Tash. What they say is, we're going to be ourselves. But it makes them blind to what they're actually offered. And they're offered a feast by Aslan. Come and enjoy the food here. But what they see instead is the kinds of things you'd find in a stable. One thinks he's eating hay. Another thinks he's just eating turnips. And a third thinks he has found a raw cabbage leaf. And so they don't realize the sumptuous meal that God or Aslan has put before them. And they are always for themselves, and so they're going to be locked out. Now, there's a question that comes up from many people about Susan Pevensie, because she does not return and does not go to the new Narnia. And so her absence is from Narnia, and it disturbs people when they say, what happened to Susan? And in fact, Philip Pullman, who is kind of the anti-Lewis, he writes some things. He hates Christians, he hates Lewis, and he says, basically, Susan can't go on, she's no longer a friend, and so he says, this will give problem to girls. And so he says, the problem is Susan's problem, according to him. Lewis's problem is sex. Lewis can't deal with sex. But that's not what Lewis is dealing with at all here. She is being tempted in one sense by nylons and lipstick. And that's more a symbol for Lewis of trying to be modern and grown up, of trying to be worldly. In fact, Lewis saw the problem was when GIs came over in World War II, they would bring chocolates and nylons and lipstick to the British girls. And the girls who would kind of surrender to that were the girls who were not the ones who would be with Aslan. In fact, he wrote a letter to a young Martin Kilmer. And the letter basically was, now Peter gets back to Narnia. I'm afraid Susan does not. Haven't you noticed in the 2 books you have read that she is rather fond of being too grown up? I'm sorry to say that side of her got stronger and she forgot about Narnia. But the books don't tell us what happened to Susan. She is left alive in the world at the end, having been turned into a rather silly, conceited young woman. But there is still plenty of time for her to mend, and perhaps she will get to Aslan's country in the end, in her own way. I think that whatever she has seen in Narnia, she could, if she was the sort of the person that wanted to, persuade herself as she grew up that it was all nonsense. But he holds out hope that everybody can be rescued by Aslan, that Aslan has planted seed and he never gives up. The last judgment goes through a stable door. And what does the word stable remind you of? where Jesus first came into our world. So it's a stable world that he came in by and a stable world that we'll all leave out by. And it's wonderful what happens. Each creature comes up to Aslan. One of two things would happen to them. They all look straight in his face. I don't think they had any choice about that. And when some looked, the expression on their faces changed terribly. It was fear and hatred. And the creatures who looked at Aslan in that way swerved to their right, his left, and disappeared into a huge black shadow, which streamed far away to the left of the doorway. The children never saw those creatures again. I don't know what became of them. But the others looked in the face of Aslan and loved him, though some of them were very frightened at the same time. But all these came in the door in on Aslan's right. And that leads us to Matthew's parable of the sheep and the goats. If we remember, Jesus said, the goats are going off to my left and the sheep are going to come to my right. And so we ask, who are the goats and the sheep? And Jesus tells us, the ones that take care of him. And here's how we divide Episcopalian and Presbyterian sheep. I'm not going to say which are going to the left or which are to the right. That's up for you all. There are no Methodist sheep there. The Methodist sheep are off having a potluck dinner. Okay. Okay. And this is why goats are going to hell. Goats really aren't very nice sometimes, even though Ben Fraser owns a couple goats over in Tanzania as part of his dowry. Okay, and here God's taking everybody except, okay, here we go again. So don't go to Las Vegas, because God knows what goes on in Las Vegas. And the only person God's taken, one person from Las Vegas. Okay. So we've had death, we've had judgment, now we go to hell for just a brief moment. Okay? There is actually a gate to hell over in Turkmenistan. If you go over there, hell is, most people involve this kind of imagery where you have an unquenchable fire. And the Canaanites worship Molech, which they would sacrifice their children, throwing them into the fire. But he, the devil and his angels. This too, Lewis says, is imagery. The prevalent image of fire is significant because it combines the ideas of torment and destruction. Okay. Okay. I'm going to go on from the Screwtape Letters. Moving on there. Here in the Screwtape Letters, if you notice, you've ever seen any work of art, there is always this kind of maw down here in the bottom, this jaw of some kind of demon that swallows the sinners. So you find it in Michelangelo, you find it in Bosch, you find it in Bruegel. All of them have this kind of image where they're going to be swallowed up into fire. Okay? You also have to recognize in this book the power of Satan and the demonic. Tashlan is the god of blasphemy and idolatry. For Aslan is saying, for he and I are such different kinds that no service which is vile can be done to me, and none which is not vile can be done to him. If any man does a cruelty in my name, Aslan's name, then though he says the name Aslan, it is Tash whom he serves, and by Tash his deed is accepted. So every time we do a good deed, it is in the name of God. Every time we do something evil, it is not in the name of God. It's for the other side. Tash comes in this book when he's called. One can find evil spirits, Lewis is saying, if one wishes. But the most important part of hell, Lewis says, is that hell is locked from the inside. There are only two kinds of people in the end. The people who say to God, your will be done, and to the people to whom God says, your will be done. God does not send anyone to hell. The logical argument is simple. If heaven is to be with God and hell is to be separated from God, the choice is clear. One creates his or her own ending. As the character George MacDonald tells the narrator, everybody in hell chooses it. Without that self-choice, there could be no hell. No soul that seriously and constantly desires joy will ever miss it. If someone has one bit of desire for God, God will feed that desire and draw that person to him. Of course, you probably all remember reading No Exit by Jean-Paul Sartre, the great existentialist. For him, hell was other people. And this is it, if you could imagine. Think right now of the two people whom you hate most. Think of two people who annoy you more than anybody else. You're going to spend eternity with them now. The three of you in a room. That's John Paul Sartre's idea of hell. But it's a very good kind of example of it. So as Jesus was born in a stable, the stable door becomes a symbolic passageway between time and eternity. And he invites everybody in. He tells Peter, the high king of Narnia, who has the keys of the kingdom. Peter is St. Peter in the gospel. He's ordered to Aslan to shut the door of Narnia. And Peter shivers with cold. He leans out into the darkness. He pulls the door to himself. It's scraped over ice as he pulls it. And then rather clumsily, for even in that moment his hands had gone numb and blue, he took out a golden key and locked the end of Narnia. And it leads us to heaven. And this is the best place to end in Narnia. You go through all of that suffering of Saturn, and finally you get Lewis's picture of what the afterlife is going to be like. He says, right now we're only living in Shadowlands. In Shadowlands we can only see things kind of bleakly through a glass darkly. But he says, basically, we're going to see it face to face. Now he says there are some misleading images of heaven. And remember Frank Astaire? Okay, we can all dance like Frank Astaire. Heaven, I'm in heaven. Okay, he goes on and on. But he says there's no need to be worried by facetious people who try to make the Christian hope of heaven ridiculous by saying they do not want to spend eternity playing harps. The answer to such people is that if they cannot understand books written for grown-ups, they should not talk about them. All the scriptural imagery about harps, crowns, golds is, of course, a merely symbolic attempt to express the inexpressible. Of course, too, in this one here, we're going to be on clouds. This is where all dogs go to heaven. How many of you have dogs? Had dogs? Okay, they'll be in heaven for you. If you had cats, I'm sorry. No cats in heaven. That's the one. I'm kidding. I'm teasing there. Okay, go on. Okay. Musical instruments are mentioned in heaven because many people, for them, music is the one thing in the present life which most strongly suggests ecstasy and the sublime. Crowns are mentioned to suggest the fact that those who are united with God in eternity share His glory and His splendor. Gold is mentioned to suggest the timelessness of heaven. Gold doesn't rust, and how precious it is. People who take these symbols literally, wrote Lewis, might as well think that when Christ told us to be like doves, He meant that we were to lay eggs. You don't take some passages literally. And then we have this beatific vision of heaven and the great divorce. And he says, I need to keep this image there, that God is going to give us a white stone with our name on it, and a new name, and He's going to dress us in new gowns and new bodies. We are all going to be made anew. And heaven's going to go back, and everything that we've messed up in our life, God is going to work that out so it turns into gold, into goodness. And so every mistake, every regret, every misery we had, every resentment is now taken by God to make into glory. And it's something we can't even imagine, but Lewis had kind of a hint of what's going to happen. The fullest depiction of Aslan's country occurs in this book. Thrown through the stable door, the children find it as a portal to another world. When the Narnians go through it, they find themselves not in a smelly, dark stable, but in a huge land of light and joy. It is a place of youth. As Jill puts it, the professor and Aunt Polly aren't much older than we are. We will all be the same age as our grandchildren. Think of it. We'll be able to run barefoot and push them around, finally. Edmund's knee ceases to be sore, and the professor suddenly feels unstiffened with abundance and beauty and freedom. They see groves of trees thick with leaves, and under every leaf there peeps out the rich colors of fruit, such as no one has ever seen in our world. Fruits compared with which the freshest grapefruit you've ever eaten was dull, and the juiciest orange was dry. Your mouth will water at these things immeasurably. One of the most significant and compelling images of heaven in the scriptures and of being with Christ is the wedding celebration, with a table of bread and wine. And here is my little daughter's wedding to Carrie, my son-in-law. I must bring, and they shall hear my voice, and there shall be one fold and one shepherd. Other sheep who do not know, who have maybe rejected a television evangelist version of Jesus, but they don't know the real Jesus, will suddenly confront the real Jesus and say, that is who I've been looking for all my life. And so all of these kind of fake ideas that we have of a mercenary Jesus or some kind of political Jesus, they will be stripped away, and the real Jesus will be face to face. And the people will recognize the voice of the shepherd. And so Emoth says, and this is the marvel of marvel, that me, a pagan, he called me beloved, me who am but a dog. Hey, what's that? Said one of the dogs. Oh, sir, said Emoth, excuse me, but it's a fashion of speech which we have in Calamarin. Well, I can't say I like it very much, said the dog. Oh, he doesn't mean any harm, said an older dog. After all, we call our puppies boys when they don't behave properly. So we do, said the first dog, or girls. Hush, said the old dog, that's not a nice word to use. Remember where you are. What is a female dog? Okay, Lewis is getting naughty there, okay? Children will never get that, but he's just throwing that in, okay? This is what Tolkien called a eucatastrophe. A catastrophe is a sudden turning of your life, but EU means good. It's a good turning of your life. You think it was awful, but it turned out for your best benefit. It was something beyond what you ever could imagine. And so he says, basically, joy is the serious business of heaven. And that's what we're going to discover as we get there. Lewis writes, the unicorn says, I have come home at last. This is my real country. I belong here. This is the land I've been looking for all my life, though I never knew it till now. Come further up and further in. You get closer to the kingdom of God and the throne of God. And there was greeting and kissing and handshaking and old jokes. You have no idea how good an old joke sounds when you take it out again after the rest of 500 or 600 years. And they all move forward to the center of the orchard. And now at last, they were beginning chapter 1 of the great story no one on earth has ever read, which does go on forever, in which every chapter is better than the one before. And we are only at the end of the last chapter of an old book, and the new book is about to begin. Thank you.
For making it through to the last battle. We have just a couple minutes if anyone has any questions. If they're really hard, save it for Thursday night, and if they're easy, let me know. Anything that you got from any of the books, but this one in particular, this the last battle, that was significant or that you enjoyed? It really is, yeah. So Art says, the best description of heaven you've ever read. It's rare to find people giving literary description to it because the symbols in Scripture are, in some sense, they're hard to touch, right? You don't want to say the wrong thing. So it's rare to find a really robust description. But he certainly does capture, I think, some of the just joy and delight. And there's this description he didn't mention, but all the people who have been to Narnia and the unicorn who lived in Narnia said they didn't recognize the country at first. They said, this is beautiful, but what is it? And it finally dawns on them that this is Narnia. It is the country, but it's the true Narnia. It's not the Narnia that they lived in, the Shadowlands, as you mentioned. So just that idea of not that all that is true and beautiful, it's recognizable, but it's recognizable like a shadow is to reality, and just turning our normal expectations on their head. We think of this as the real world, and we're going to something who knows where, but it's exactly the opposite, is that this is the shadow and the reality is more substantial. Or in The Great Divorce, he talks about, grass so real that it would cut your feet if you stepped on it. Like it's more real than our current situation. Anything else stand out about the book? Yeah, Barb?
For me, it gives great hope.
Yeah,
You know, if you want to think of any, a single word.
yeah. Yeah, it's a very hopeful book. You're absolutely right. And he also plays with some some theology in terms of that character Emeth, where he says the name means true and faithful, but he's not a Narnian. So he's dealing with this difficult question of what do Christians make of people who are maybe not part of our community, but who are doing the best they can with the revelation that they've received. So that was the sort of most risky part of the book from a sort of traditional perspective. He was saying that was the quote he raised up where he said, anything that you've done that is true and good, you've done as service to me, Aslan says. And everything that you did that was evil and bad is to service to the false god, basically. So it's a very interesting way of thinking about that question. Anything else? Okay, well, if you haven't read the books, hopefully this has stimulated you enough to just sort of go out and at least try them out. For those of you who have been reading along, bring all those thoughts and questions on Thursday night when our speaker will be here in person. Thank you all very much.